did our ancestors survive during the Paleolithic? How did they start farming? Always linked to their environment, early humans went through the most important revolution in history. And it begins here. Our story begins here. The planet Earth. The time is a few thousand years before the beginnings of written history, during the beginnings of the human age. Our focus will be on the vast scope of prehistory, both the Paleolithic and Neolithic, or Old and New Stone Ages, and how our ancestors sustained themselves in the ever-changing environments. Our own species is thought to have emerged in Africa around 300,000 years ago, during what is called the Middle Paleolithic. Most scholars agree that it was during this period that humans began migrating out of Africa. By the next period, the Upper Paleolithic, humans had populated most parts of the world, displacing and mixing with the Neanderthal and Denisovans. This didn't mean early humans left the region that would be the sub-Saharan abandoned. Humans had spread all over the continent, and like the rest of their counterparts around the world, relied on hunting and gathering to survive. Some even used early versions of the bow and arrow, which had been in use since the end of the Middle Paleolithic. With their special toolkits and social cooperation, they were able to live off the plants and animals in their environments. Some of the oldest art we've discovered depicts the means of subsistence of early humans. Migrations continued in Africa throughout the Upper Paleolithic, and by the Neolithic, some groups settled into small communities. Most of sub-Saharan Africa was able to rely on hunting and gathering, or produce their own food through pastoralism, but those around the three major river valleys, that of the Upper Nile, Niger, and Congo, were able to settle into agricultural communities. It is even believed the Niger Valley is the origin of agriculture in the sub-Saharan, around 5,000 years ago. The first region we know of to practice agriculture is the Near East. Here, the transition from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic began 20,000 years ago, a period known as the Epipaleolithic. This was towards the end of the last glacial period, when the changing climate led to different means of survival for many humans. The Earth is currently in an ice age, called the Cenozoic, which began just under 34 million years ago. An ice age, or more accurately named Icehouse Earth, occurs when our planet has the presence or expansion of glaciers, like we currently have on the poles. Climate can alternate between icehouse and greenhouse periods, where temperatures rise, and no glaciers exist anywhere. On the extreme is hothouse Earth, in which the planet becomes uninhabitably warm, and snowball Earth, when the planet's surface becomes entirely frozen. This ice age is still currently ongoing, although we are in an interglacial period, which began as the ice sheets receded, and temperatures increased around 11,700 years ago, after the period of the Younger Dryas. The Neolithic began around 10,000 BCE, and it wasn't long after that areas in the Near East and Levant had settled in more sedentary communities. These were generally along a very fruitful curve of land known as the Fertile Crescent. In this part of the world, the Neolithic was divided into two main periods. The pre-pottery Neolithic lasted until 6500 BCE, and the pottery Neolithic continued until around 4000 BCE, around the start of the Copper Age. Having been experimented on for thousands of years prior, cereals like wheat and barley, lentils, peas, and figs were the main foods produced by the start of the Neolithic. Later, those of the Near East would also domesticate sheep, goats, and cattle. Agricultural communities favored a sedentary lifestyle, as opposed to the previous migratory way of life of the hunter-gatherer. But the shift wasn't instant. In various communities, there would be agriculturalists, herders, and also hunters. They would trade their foods with each other, giving more people a more varied diet. the rise of sedentism led to the construction of more permanent settlements. These would be all over the Near East by the end of the Neolithic. Most remained quite small, supporting 100 to 200 inhabitants. One of the oldest is Tel Caramel, located in Syria, thought to be settled near to 11,000 BCE, with no evidence of agriculture. Settled nearby, around 9600 BCE, would be the mysterious Göbekli Tepe. It is still thought to be a pre-agricultural settlement, but only a small percentage of it has currently been excavated, so we need more time before we come to any conclusions about this Anatolian wonder. We currently have more information about other settlements, those which we know practiced agriculture, like Abu Huraira, founded around 9500 BCE, by those who could have been the world's first farmers. Jericho, or Tel es-Sultan, in the present-day West Bank, was also founded in the 9000s BCE, and would be a prominent city for thousands of years. The location had already been occupied by the late Epipaleolithic, by those known as the Natufian. They predated agriculture, but were a sedentary or semi-sedentary people. It is through the Natufians and later residents of Jericho that we have gleaned so much about the early transition to agriculture. It seems fairly certain that initially, sedentism is what led to agriculture, not the other way around. Çatalhöyük, in Anatolia, was founded later, around 7500 BCE, but also served as a major agricultural settlement. Inhabitants at Jericho and Çatalhöyük could have numbered anywhere from 3 to 8,000, scores higher than other settlements of the Levant and Near East. They would eventually turn into the first large urban centers of the world. During the later Neolithic, the Yarmoukhian culture were thought to have produced the first pottery in the region, signaling the pottery Neolithic period. They were situated around Shoar Hagalan, in the Levant, from 6400 BCE, and their pottery signaled a division of labor that would only become more stark. In Oceania, and the southeastern region of Asia, the Paleolithic took a much different form. During the glacial period, when sea levels were lower, these areas were composed of three major landmasses. East Asia, which would primarily become China and Korea, lay to the north. To the south was Sundaland, a landmass composed of Southeast Asia and many Indonesian islands. To the south of that was Sahul, a paleocontinent composed of present-day Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania. Though the sea levels were lower, connecting many islands to the mainland, Sundaland and Sahul were not connected. Because of this, we know that humans needed some kind of watercraft in order to reach Sahul from Sundaland. Evidence suggests humans settled on Sahul as far back as 55 to 65,000 years ago. It's possible that the first humans to arrive in Southeast Asia encountered a species of archaic human called the Denisovans, who were thought to be genetically linked to the Neanderthals of Europe. Interbreeding occurred here as well, and the Denisovans became extinct, but small amounts of their DNA still resides in many populations, including those of the former Sundaland region, and even Native Americans. There is still much work being done on the Denisovans, and information can change in the future. Evidence suggests that once humans arrived on Sahul, settlement of the continent was quite rapid. Some of the first locations settled were most likely the Majid-Bebe rock shelter, and Lake Mungo, where archaeologists have discovered the oldest human remains in Australia, dating to 40,000 years ago, as well as Mungo Lady, the remains of possibly the oldest cremation and ceremonial burial in the world. Australia was full of megafauna when humans first arrived, but they became extinct through hunting, climate change, and ecosystem disruption. Humans in Australia never had a Neolithic phase, and remained hunter-gatherers until European colonization, thousands of years later. To the northwest are the vast expanses of Central Asia. In these regions, you can find monumental mountains, barren deserts, and the wide unending plains, the grassland steppes, which would become home to the nomadic tribes of a later period. Because of the harsh climate, humans didn't settle in the region until quite late, only around 50,000 years ago, as the cold conditions improved. Arriving from the Near East, humans found it possible to survive on the large plant eaters in the Asian interior, like horses and mammoth. Some of these sites have been discovered in the Altai Mountains in present-day Mongolia, and in Siberia. The ice sheets continued to grow though, and over 20,000 years ago, reached their greatest extent, called the last glacial maximum. Though not everywhere was covered in ice, temperatures were around 6 to 7 degrees Celsius, or 11 Fahrenheit colder than in the modern day. It caused drought, and North Asia became a dry desert of frost. Many of the more northern settlements, like in Siberia, were abandoned. Once the ice sheets began their recession, around 17,000 years ago, settlers returned, occupying Siberia, Mongolia, and eastern Russia. Some of the oldest pottery in Asia would be made here, around the banks of the Amur River, before the end of the last ice age, by cultures known as the Gromatuka and the Osipovka. The pottery wasn't associated with sedentism or a Neolithic tradition, but was used as a type of hot pot in order to keep warm. Further to the north would be the Duktai, the beginnings of a Paleoarctic tradition. Modern humans began to migrate into Europe from the Near East, around the start of the Upper Paleolithic. Europe, like Southeast Asia, was also already occupied by another of our distant cousins, the Neanderthal. The Neanderthal were more closely related to the Denisovan. Both would share the same fate, dying out and interbreeding with humans, ultimately being absorbed. These early humans to enter Europe were called Cro-Magnon, and would produce Paleolithic industries of their own. The first major one was the Aurignacian, from around 43 to 33,000 years ago, before a transition period. It was near the end of this time frame, through natural selection, that these humans gradually became more lighter-skinned than those nearer to the equator. The Aurignacian is characterized by their bone and antler projectile points. They also produced some of the earliest cave art in the world, at the Chauvet cave in southern France, depicting many species now extinct in Europe. They also produced the first figurines depicting humans. The Venus of Hohlefels is dated to around 35,000 years ago, and though not human, the Lion Man of Hohensteinstadel is dated even older, at 40,000 years ago. Archaeologists have also found tools at the Kostenki site in Eastern Europe, also developed by early modern humans. These tools aren't Aurignacian, and suggest another group of humans, or perhaps many different groups, also entered Europe from different areas. From around 33,000 years ago, the Aurignacian transitioned into another culture, known as the Gravettian. The Gravettian culture lasted until around 21,000 years ago. They are known for their figures of women, which we call Venus figurines, and their more advanced hunting kits. In Western Europe, to deal with the cold of the glacial period, they fashioned their own clothing, and lived in partially subterranean caves, using oil lamps made of stone. Those in Eastern Europe relied less on caves, and had more access to the mammoth on more open fields. They developed burial rituals, which included burying the deceased with offerings and their personal jewelry. In the Czech Republic, a burial of 3 bodies was found, each wearing necklaces made of teeth. The ground above their burial was covered in red ochre, a common burial color. Most of the Venus figurines discovered were from this time period. Much of the rupestral cave art from Western Europe was also created during this period. The Gravettian culture seems to split around 21,000 years ago, around the time of the last glacial maximum, with the Solutrean emerging in Western Europe, before transitioning into the Magdalenian 17,000 years ago, which would last until the end of the glacial period in 10,000 BCE. Barbed bone points were also more common, along with ivory implements. They not only used animal bones and ivory for their toolkits, they used animals themselves during hunts. Dogs were one of the first animals to be domesticated and were helpful for early human survival. As the ice sheets receded after the last glacial maximum, humans began reoccupying those more northern European regions. Trade networks began to grow, and would reach their height during the Magdalenian. Art flourished as well, and the most famous cave paintings of Spain and France, like Lascaux or the Cave of Altamira, were created during this period. Ivory and bone objects and tools were also still widely used. It's even possible some bone etchings might have been used as crude calendars. The Magdalenian would be one of the most complex cultures of the Paleolithic in Europe. The first Americans arrived via Beringia, a land bridge connecting North America and Asia that existed from around the start of the Upper Paleolithic, when the sea levels were lower, until around 12,000 years ago. It had previously been thought that the first Americans quickly migrated to the New World and used the large megafauna as their means of subsistence, which led to mass extinctions. Further research shows a more complicated picture. Toolkits were based on each individual environment and ecology, and megafauna weren't always the main food source. In the Great Basin, the Paleo-Indians, as the first Americans were called, hunted a wide range of land animals and gathered a wide range of plants, but they would rely on marine life, mainly small fish like the tui chub. The Channel Islands, an archipelago off the coast of California, shows evidence of subsistence on mussels, shellfish, sea mammals, and birds. This also suggests the use of boats or other kinds of marine vessels. In the Great Plains of North America, the Paleo-Indian Clovis culture would flourish. They are known for their distinct Clovis points, which they used to hunt the mighty mammoth and other megafauna. It was first believed the Clovis were the first Paleo-Indians in the Americas, around 12 to 14,000 years ago, but more recent evidence has uncovered sites predating the Clovis by thousands of years. In South America, the archaeological site near Tres Arroyos, Argentina, provides 40 skeletons, and an assemblage of tools used to hunt South American megafauna, including guanaco, a mammal closely related to the llama, and Megatherium, a giant ground sloth. Paleo-Indians all over the Americas learned to subsist on multiple sources of food, from fish to small mammals, from megafauna to insects. Though smaller animals often weren't worth the calories to hunt, humans worked in cooperation with one another, to expend less energy and collect more food. From the mid-9000s onwards, would be the Holocene, what we call the Human Age. The end of the glacial period was underway, the Younger Dryas had finished, and the beginnings of agriculture and permanent settlements was about to commence. The Paleolithic made way for the Neolithic, or New Stone Age. How did humans survive in this new world, a world after the cold and ice? It all began with the most powerful revolution in human history. We call this the Neolithic Revolution. This refers to the change from early humans relying on hunting and gathering, to producing their own food, either through agriculture or animal husbandry. Scientists still do not know the exact causes that brought about this shift, but the change in temperature played a part, as well as humans having to adapt to a new environment, while those that didn't, died out. From the diets of those in the Paleolithic, we can tell that those in the Near East were familiar with eating wild seeds, full of protein. By the time of the Neolithic, they had already begun to experiment with these seeds in new ways. They began to collect more, and implemented ways to store these seeds once they grew and ripened, and extend the window to eat them. This tinkering was the beginning of plant cultivation. The first experimentation with seeds occurred during the Epipaleolithic, but it would take thousands of years, until the 9000s, to get to full-scale agriculture. For hunter-gatherers, this meant following the spread of wild plants, and staying to observe how they grew, giving humans a motive to remain in the area. This forced a trend towards a sedentary lifestyle. Staying in one area, humans were able to observe wild plants, when they lived and died, and their seed production. This privilege could only be achieved by those in regions with abundant enough resources to start with. This is how we know that initially it was sedentism that predated agriculture. Agriculture is the full-scale plant cultivation and raising of livestock, and culmination of the plant experiments done during the Epipaleolithic. We have found evidence of small-scale plant cultivation at sites like Ohalo II, a small community of hunters and fishers on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, dated to 23,000 years ago, a full 8,000 years before the Natufian, and 11,000 years before the Neolithic farming communities of the Near East. But we don't know how extensive their cultivations were. By around 8,500 BCE, the Near East would have many prominent agricultural settlements like Jericho, Tel Aswad, and Neva-li-Chori. Agriculture is more than just a means of food production from plants. Agriculturalists often also domesticated animals like cattle, sheep, and goats. They were able to produce grains and meats, which needed storage. From this came the rise of pottery, an efficient storage system for their food. So generally speaking, when we talk about agriculture, it isn't only plant cultivation, but animal husbandry, and pottery as well. Those were all evident from the early Neolithic sites in the Near East and Southeast Europe. Near the end of the glacial period, as the world was getting warmer, there was an interruption of almost 1,000 years called the Younger Dryas, which temporarily made it colder. This affected the availability of seeds and other foods which hunter-gatherers relied. Because of this, humans migrated where wild grass and seeds were still available. Early humans would settle down in these regions, adapt, and learn about their new food sources. Those who couldn't, perished. The road from early sedentism to agriculture was a long process. The Natufians were an early sedentary culture, with settlements found in Israel, Jordan, and Lebanon, dating to the 12th or 11th millennia BCE. They characterized the first phase of agriculture, experimenting with seeds, and intentional planting of these seeds. The second phase were the early settlements at Göbekli Tepe, Chayonu, and Neva-li-Chori, in eastern Turkey, dating to the 10th and 9th millennia BCE. The third phase was characterized by settlements like Jericho, with sedentary hunter-gatherers, domesticated plants, and domesticated animals. The next millennia would bring the spread of these new techniques all throughout the Fertile Crescent, including the early civilizations in Sumer and Egypt. Agriculture was based on the domestication of both plants and animals. The word derives from domus, the Latin name for house. Domestication modifies wild species to make them more suitable for humans. These modifications would forever change the relationship between human and Mother Nature. Typically, domestication would occur by choosing a wild species that could provide food. For plant species, they usually provided carbohydrates, sugars, and starches, while animal species were rich in protein. Apart from food sources, animals could provide humans with other benefits, like an ox working the fields, or a dog helping with hunting or herding. Sheep could provide wool for clothing, and some animals simply became pets. We still value these same animals today, thousands of years later. One of the first domesticated animals was the dog, possibly through the grey wolf, anywhere from 30 to 15,000 years ago. Humans developed close relationships with wolves early on, and chose the less aggressive and friendlier ones to breed. This created a feedback loop, where those humans who were more friendly with their dogs survived longer. Later, around 10,000 years ago, goats, and later cattle and sheep, were domesticated in the East Mediterranean region. It was around this time that numerous other plants and animals became domesticated. In the Fertile Crescent, domestication was of wheats, barley, lentils, and chickpeas, while rice was being domesticated in the Yangtze River Valley. In Mexico, around 9,000 years back, maize was being domesticated. Sheep, goats, and cattle were domesticated in the Near East, and cattle domestication also appeared in the Indus Valley, and possibly sub-Saharan Africa. Later plant domestications include potatoes and tobacco in the Andes region, and squash and sunflowers in Mesoamerica. Chicken would be domesticated in Southeast Asia, while horses were in the Eurasian steppes. These were developed independently, and most other regions that would domesticate plants and animals learned it through migrants or traders of these initial regions. Domesticated plants are quite different from their wild counterparts, and in many cases are so different that they can't survive without human intervention. Domesticated species of both plants and animals are usually products of selective breeding, to highlight certain traits early humans found positive. This often caused the species to lose many traits it previously possessed. For example, the food we know as corn today began to be domesticated in Mexico over 9,000 years ago, we believe from a grass called teosinte, chosen because of its large seeds. Over time, corn began to look as it does today, with even larger seeds, but they cannot naturally reproduce anymore. Though there are a multitude of plants and animals on this planet, those that we domesticated over 10,000 years ago are those that are still most important to us. Our most significant crops are still wheat, rice, and maize, and the most domesticated animals are cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats. Our selective breeding process hasn't stopped, and has even increased in the modern age, with the addition of molecular manipulation. From what we can gather, agriculture first developed in the Near East because of the Fertile Crescent. The productive soil gave humans the opportunity to experiment with plant and animal domestication. Wild plants were aplenty, as well as goats, pigs, and oryx. In this region, the most common food produced was wheat, like einkorn or emmer. Barley was also produced, and selectively modified from 2-rode barley to 6-rode, increasing the size and amount of seeds in order to produce more food. Legumes, fruits, and nuts were domesticated and bred to be larger. In the Near East, animal domestication began not long after plant domestication, as wild animals were herded and killed for their meat. It is thought that goats were the first to be domesticated in the Near East, followed by sheep, pigs, and cattle. They were selectively bred to produce more meat and to be more docile. Though humans artificially selected certain features, some would occur by consequence of natural selection. Domesticated animals would often have different kinds of hair or horns than their wild counterparts. Teeth would become more crowded with their reduced jaw sizes, and those used for labor would have more bone deformities. The overcrowding in small pens also contributed to the spread of more sickness and disease. The Fertile Crescent was a perfect location to begin experimentation because it was such a resource-rich area. Though predating agriculture, the Natufians of the Epipaleolithic, who we previously mentioned, were a sedentary society of hunter-gatherers, living off wild animals and wild cereals. They did experiment with different farming techniques though, and are thought to be the forerunners of the Neolithic farmers at Abu Huraira in the Levant. By around 6000 BCE, agriculture was firmly established in the Near East, and from there would spread northwest into Europe, southwest into North Africa, and east into Iran and beyond. But there were many who developed agriculture independently of the Near East, although a bit later. These include the river valleys in China, a few locations in the Americas, along the border of sub-Saharan Africa, and in the swamps of Papua New Guinea. At the end of the last glacial period, humans began to occupy the Nile Valley, as it supported a wide variety of wildlife, a perfect place for hunter-gatherers to thrive. Oryx, gazelle, and hartebeest on land, and fish and birds in the waters. They also took advantage of nearby plant life, like the edible tubers of Cyperus sedges. Food wasn't a problem, but the flooding from the Nile was quite dangerous before those of the valley learned to control it. During the end of the Paleolithic, further south in the central Nile Valley, the Kadan culture emerged around 13,000 to 9,000 years ago. They were characterized by their burials in cemeteries, like Jebel Sahaba in northern Sudan. Though they were hunter-gatherers, they would tend to their local plant life, and are thought to be the precursors of the later agriculturalists in Egypt. Consensus is that agriculture came to Egypt from the Levant, and the first area we find domesticated crops is the town of El Badari from around 5500 BCE. Domesticated animals date to a bit later, from Nabta Playa in the Western Desert, one of the oldest Neolithic sites in Egypt. During the early Neolithic, the region received much more rainfall, forming a large lake, making it quite an attractive location to settle. Pottery and sandstone monoliths have been found here. Further along was Jebel Ramla Playa, home to societies of herders and pastoralists. Oryx, goats, and sheep were herded, taking advantage of the seasonal grasslands of the Sahara, a region which at the time was more savanna than desert. Cemeteries were also found here, some dated to around 4500 BCE, including the oldest infant cemetery in the world. Near the end of the Neolithic, North Africa became drier, leading to more aridity and less water. The savannas became more desert-like, and people had to move towards more reliable water sources, like the Nile. From El Badari, developed the Badarian culture, which might have emerged from around 5000 BCE, and flourished from 4400. This culture was marked by permanent settlements based on agriculture, fishing, and animal husbandry. Large pits, most likely granaries, would store their crops, like emmer wheat and barley. Their livestock, like cows and sheep, as well as their dogs, used for herding, were often given ceremonial burial. Human burials were positioned towards the south, with their faces pointed towards the west, which in later traditions would be associated with the land of the dead. Malachite was also mined, with its bright green color used for cosmetic purposes. While the Badarian flourished in Upper Egypt, another culture emerged in Lower Egypt, in the Nile Delta. This was the Merimde culture, with their main settlement at Merimde Beni Salama, just northwest of present-day Cairo. They also practiced agriculture near their mud-covered houses, relying on the Near East staples of wheat, barley, cattle, goats, and pigs. These late Neolithic cultures would become the basis for the cultures of the more commonly studied ancient period of Egyptian history. After the cold period of the Younger Dryas, East Asia experienced a warming which brought subtropical plants and animals to the Yangtze Valley. One of these plants was wild rice, and it was from this that East Asians first began to successfully experiment. Rice would eventually come to be the staple food domesticate in East and Southeast Asia. The two major river valleys, the Yellow River and Yangtze, would each take slightly different paths due to slightly different climates. The Yangtze was wetter, and the major plant domesticate would be rice. They domesticated chicken, pig, dog, and water buffalo, and lived a life of agriculture and farming. Unlike the Near East, sheep nor goats appear to have been domesticated in East Asia during this period. In the north, climate was a bit cooler, and instead of rice, the main crops were broom corn and foxtail millet. They subsisted from a more mixed economy, by also hunting and fishing. At the site of Tien Lushan, just south of Shanghai, evidence of rice spikelets dating from the 5000s BCE shows that domestication of rice took hundreds of years, but over time domesticated rice gradually became more of a staple, while wild rice declined. It took hundreds of years more to reach Korea and eventually Japan. In South Asia, the earliest food producers would emerge around the Indus River. The first site discovered, called Harappa, was discovered in the early 19th century, and would give name to the Harappan civilization. More sites were discovered along the Indus and its tributaries in western Pakistan and northwestern India, in Gujarat and Rajasthan. Some sites were discovered further out, near Afghanistan. Most of the sites were located along a now dried-up river, called the Saraswati. The Harappan were thought to be the first food producers in South Asia, but there is evidence agriculture had been practiced much earlier, during the pre-Harappan phase. At Mehrgarh, present-day Pakistan, agriculture was thought to have developed around 6500 BCE, most likely having spread from the Near East, although some believe it emerged independently. The main crop was barley, while cattle, water buffalo, and goats were domesticated. A bit further along, heading southeast, we find another region to independently develop agriculture. The Melanesians, those closely related to the indigenous Australians, and who would later be called Papuans, resided in New Guinea, practicing small-scale horticulture over 9,000 years ago. The Kook Swamp is an archaeological site located in the highlands of Papua New Guinea. It is a wetland area that was once a large pond, and was used for agricultural purposes by the Melanesians, who lived in the area for thousands of years. Archaeological research at the site has revealed a complex system of raised fields and canals that were used to grow taro, their staple crop. The Kook Swamp is considered one of the oldest and most extensive examples of prehistoric agricultural systems in the world, and is thought to have been in use for thousands of years. By the 4000s BCE, there is evidence of the cultivation of bananas and sugarcane. Though this is one of the few places on Earth where agriculture independently developed, practices didn't spread far from the island. Out of all the continents of the prehistoric world we inhabited, the only one to not have produced agriculture independently was Europe. From around 7500 BCE, agriculture slowly flowed into Europe from the Near East, and hunter-gatherer communities gradually became mixed or replaced with farmers. It took over 5,000 years for agriculture to arrive in the furthest regions, like Britain and the northern reaches of Scandinavia. During the long process, many dense forests of Europe slowly became flat fields used for grazing and farming. There is some debate on how exactly agriculture spread here, with the two main theories being cultural and demic diffusion. Cultural diffusion deals with agriculture spreading through cultural practices. Trade networks from Anatolia into Europe were firmly established by the Neolithic, and Europeans could have exchanged their goods for goods from the Near East, like crops, seeds, or domesticated animals. The demic diffusion theory deals with agriculture spreading through the people themselves, possibly from the migrations of farming communities from the Near East heading into Europe. Cultural diffusion seems to be the more dominant means of agricultural spread, but migrations did occur as well. Descendants of Anatolian farmers, known as the early European farmers, or EEF, were the first farmers to migrate into Europe, starting from around 9,000 years ago. They often came at odds with the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who had been there previously, but there was often mixing. Two major pottery cultures of the Neolithic, the Cardium-ware culture of southern Europe and the linear pottery culture, or LBK of Central Europe, have common ancestors in EEF populations, originating from the Balkans. It was through the LBK culture, first in the east, that agriculture began to flow westward, across the plains of the Danube. In sub-Saharan Africa, most of Central and Southern Africa remained inhabited by hunter-gatherers. These hunter-gatherers had an advanced toolkit with microliths, used for hunting or digging up plants. Microliths are smaller than older Paleolithic weapons, and were adapted for a wider variety of use, like hunting smaller animals instead of megafauna. They generally lived in smaller bands, and populations would remain steady as they didn't practice any type of food production. This meant they followed migratory patterns of their food to optimize resource acquisition. Over 6,000 years ago, in present-day Namibia, the Twyfelfontein Valley had been inhabited by the Wilton culture. They developed a bone tool industry, and created wooden implements to dig up edible roots, which was their main staple. Some of the rock engravings here date back 9 to 10,000 years ago, and span thousands of years. Another group of hunter-gatherers lived far to the east, in Japan. These groups were quite unique, in that they were hunter-gatherers, but would come to produce stunning pottery. They were called the Jomon, and their culture is traditionally dated to 14,000 BCE, still during the Upper Paleolithic, and would continue in different phases for over 10,000 years, until 300 BCE. Migrating from the mainland, they entered Japan via a land bridge that existed until the ocean levels rose once the glacial period ended, separating Japan from the rest of Asia. Jomon, meaning cord-marked, was in reference to their pottery and its corded impressions. Pottery itself was mistakenly only thought to be seen with agricultural societies, yet it has been found here, while the Jomon domesticated neither plant nor animal at this time. Some of the oldest pottery in the whole world comes from the Jomon, excavated from Odai Yamamoto, and is dated to 13,500 BCE. Fukui and Senpukuji Cave are other sites with early pottery, from what is called the incipient period, the first Jomon phase. Most of the pottery from this period were fairly simple large bowls. Most of these early sites are found in caves, but some like Sojiyama were outdoor pit houses. Most of their lithic tools were spear points or other hunting materials, so we believe the early Jomon subsisted through hunting more than plant gathering. The initial Jomon period, beginning in 9000 BCE, saw more outdoor settlements with pit houses, called Tatianajukio, and the beginnings of their cord-marked pottery. The Nakano B site contains over 500 dwellings, and excavations have brought to light over 400,000 items used by the initial or early Jomon. Their proximity to the Tsugaru Channel gave them the ability to sustain themselves through fishing, allowing them to remain sedentary instead of migrating to follow food sources. The early Jomon period, beginning in around 5000 BCE, saw a boom in population size and the increase in pit houses. If the Jomon did practice plant domestication, it was most likely around this time, but seems to have remained small scale. The Natsushima Shell Mound was a midden, or dump, for the Jomon near the shores of the Pacific, in the Kanto region of Japan. Fish bones, shellfish, like mollusk shells, and botanical materials were found in the waste mound. New pottery like storage jars and shallow bowls were made during the early Jomon period. Lacquerware was made using lacquer, from the lacquer tree, and became more common during this time as well. Torihama was another shell midden, but also had a nearby settlement. Up to half of the Jomon calories consumed here were from plant foods, and there is evidence of small-scale plant cultivation as well. Hunting was of course also largely practiced. One of their wild food sources was the Japanese wolf, a now extinct subspecies of gray wolf. A large part of the Jomon diet during the early period was from plants, subsisting on roots and grasses during the warmer months. During the autumn, acorns, chestnuts, and fruit were gathered. Hunting deer, boar, and wolves occurred mainly during the winter. Fish, marine mammals, and shellfish were also largely consumed. Though they practiced small-scale plant cultivation, produced pottery, and were semi-sedentary, it wasn't until a later period that the Jomon would learn larger-scale rice farming from the mainland, and even longer for Japan to become an agricultural society. It took quite a while for Europe as well. Though farming had been introduced by the EEF, the early European farmers, the long transitional period after the Upper Paleolithic until the Neolithic was called the Mesolithic, or Middle Stone Age. It was characterized by the new ways of life of the hunter-gatherers in a post-glacial Europe. It continued until the Neolithic expansion, which began in Southeast Europe, spread across the continent. This meant different regions experienced different Mesolithic timeframes, the most general timeframe for all of Europe being between 8500 to 3500 BCE. Southeast Europe, adopting agriculture relatively quickly after the Upper Paleolithic, barely had any Mesolithic period compared to Northwest Europe. The Frankthi cave, in Greece, occupied during the Upper Paleolithic, was abandoned during the cold period of the Younger Dryas, but was resettled afterwards. These Mesolithic hunters relied more on sea life, like fish and mollusks. Deep-sea fishing made tuna a major part of the diet. Around 7000 BCE, the caves show evidence of plant and animal domestication, thought to be some of the earliest pieces of agriculture in Europe, and possibly where the early European farmers originated before spreading across Europe. As stated earlier, agricultural diffusion in this region was most likely by pre-pottery Neolithic farmers from the Near East, settling in these regions before spreading across Mesolithic Europe. The Mesolithic might seem similar to the Upper Paleolithic, but the hunter-gatherers in this post-glacial environment had to adapt to different survival strategies. They had more than just the cold open tundra, and now established themselves near the coasts, or by lakes, or the deep European forests. They continued migratory patterns in search of food sources, relying more on hunting than gathering, using larger animals for protein, and adding smaller game like otters and beavers for their fur. The Ertebøller culture, practiced in Denmark around the same time as the larger LBK and Cardium cultures, settled away from the dense forests, and took advantage of marine life on the beaches and shores, hunting and trapping numerous bird species. In Britain, one of the most informative Mesolithic sites is Star Carr, in North Yorkshire. It has often been compared to the Neolithic Stonehenge in importance, a structure we will discuss in our next mega-documentary. It was settled around 9300 BCE, as sea levels were still slowly rising, and Britain was still connected to mainland Europe. Back then, the inhabitants of Star-Kar resided near a paleolake called Lake Flixton. The site is so significant, as Britain's oldest structure was found here, along with organic red deer headdresses and toolkits, well preserved in the waterlogged peat. Normally, only the lithic, or stone tools survive. Toolkits also changed from the Paleolithic. Microlithic technology evolved, along with watercraft. Small boats made with wooden skins were used to travel across substantial bodies of water. Roughly around the same time as the Mesolithic and Neolithic in Eurasia, the Americas experienced a transition of their own. The Paleo-Indian period transitioned with the warmer weather. Megafauna were less numerous, and early Americans changed their hunting strategies, tailoring them to their respective regions, leading to different cultural traditions. This new period was called the Archaic, beginning in around 8000 BCE, lasting for thousands of years more. The Archaic was also experienced differently in each region. On the plateau of present-day United States, just west of the plains, climate warmed and became wetter, allowing large conifer trees to grow, creating lakes and forests. The Archaic peoples living in the region adapted, subsisting on smaller forest animals like deer, rabbits, marmots, and different birds. In the Rocky Mountains, specifically the Helen Lookingbill site in Wyoming, Archaic hunters would gather to create tools to use from nearby quartzite and chert sources. From this campsite, they hunted mountain prey, like mountain sheep and porcupines, and traveled down to the plains for bison. The main antagonist of the bison, though, were those who lived and hunted on the plains. The Clovis culture had transitioned into the Folsom, which used different projectile tips, often using bison bone. The Folsom and later Plano cultures would dominate the plains, and even spread well into Canada. Those in the southeast seemed to value stone sources more than anything. High-quality stone was often brought over substantial distances from the interior, to camps on the coasts. Nearby would provide archaeologists with arguably one of the most stunning and important discoveries ever. In the early 1980s, on the eastern coast of Florida, Windover Farms, a new luxury housing development was being built. During the digging of a muck pond, one of the crane operators noticed a sight of concern. There were human skulls in his crane. Believing this to be a recent murder, the authorities were called. But after examining the skull's teeth, it became clear these didn't belong to any human of modern society. Initial estimates were that these people lived around 1500 BCE, but radiocarbon dating placed the bones back to over 7,000 years ago, during Archaic North America. Further excavations would reveal the remains of 168 people, all well preserved in the peat. This peat was airtight, protecting the remains from decay from the air, and wasn't acidic like most peat, but neutral. Archaeologists quickly realized this was a cemetery. The remains were from all ages, from infants to around 60. The preservation of the bones and grave goods, like toolkits and fabric, has given archaeologists invaluable knowledge of the ways of life in Archaic America. There is evidence of conflict, some with skull fractures, and one with a spear point embedded in the pelvis. A 15-year-old boy with spina bifida, most likely paralyzed from the waist down, was buried here as well. This demonstrates that his hunter-gatherer society was committed to his survival for the long term. While most of North America hunted, the Southwest gathered. The peoples of the Great Basin and the deserts of the Southwest and northern Mexico mainly relied on semi-domesticated plants like the prickly pear cactus and other small cacti. Continuing into Mesoamerica, we have found evidence of plant cultivation early in the Archaic. By 7000 BCE, teosinte, a wild grass, was domesticated into an early form of maize, a food which would spread from there into Northern and South America, becoming the most important crop. but South America independently produced agriculture on their own as well, maybe even earlier. There is evidence the Las Vegas culture, in Ecuador, produced their own squash and arrowroots. South America, along with the Near East, China, and their Mesoamerican neighbors, are one of the 4 earliest independent practitioners of agriculture in the world. In the Andes, present-day Peru and Bolivia, the potato was first domesticated, with estimates anywhere from 8 to 5,000 BCE. To the east, there is another proposed region of the world where agriculture developed independently. This is the Amazon basin, and remains the most mysterious region of South America. Cassava, or manioc, was domesticated here by 7000 BCE or earlier. Rock shelters in the Amazon changed archaeologists' understanding of this region, as it shows humans had reached here much earlier than previously thought. Today, the Amazon contains the largest number of uncontacted tribes on Earth. Though we're at the end of this documentary, we are far from through with this period. There are many more themes to go over, so join us in a bit, as we delve into part 2 of our 8-part deep dive through prehistory.